Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of budget formats. When we talk about budget formats, we're literally talking about the way in which a budget looks. And so in this week, we're going to talk primarily about four main types of budget formats. We're going to talk about line item budgets, we'll talk about performance-based budgets, program-based budgets, and then finally zero-based budgeting. But before we get into talking about each individual type of budget, and providing examples of each, I think it's important to create a good frame of reference for understanding why we have seen this evolution, this development of different budget formats over time. And a really great frame of reference comes to us from Alan Schick, and Alan Schick's article looking at the purpose of budgeting and specifically the purpose of using different types of budget formats. According to Alan Schick, there are three main reasons why we can use a budget format or a budget document. One reason for a budget document is to help us control our expenditures. So we can control the amount of money we are spending, and we can also control what we are spending that money on. The second purpose for a budget document is to use the document to help us better manage our organizations. So we can see the inflow of revenue and compare that with the outflow of expenditures. So we use it as a management tool. Clearly, if we're going to use a budget document to help us manage our organization, we're going to have more information provided to us in that budget document as compared to the budget that we will be using just to try and control our spending. Then the third reason why we might want to use a budget document is for the purpose of strategic planning. That the budget document can help us plan the operations of our organization to see how all the different elements of our organization work together to help us create our outputs, and those outputs then hopefully will lead to desired outcomes. So control, management, and planning are three primary purposes that you can use a budget document for. As we go through our discussion of our four main budget formats, you will see how budget formats have developed in order to move us from a very narrow focus on controlling expenditures to a much more rational orientation where we want to manage how our organizations operate, and we also want to use the budget as an integral part of our strategic planning process. So historically, and by historically we mean the 1800s, the early 1900s, budgeting was done in what we call lump sum variety. So in a lump sum type of budget, an agency was given literally a lump sum of money and could then spend that money pretty much however they saw fit. Problem clearly with lump sum budgeting is that you had absolutely no control over how much you were spending and what you were spending that money on. So we see the advent of line item budgeting in the early 1900s, whereby we start to delineate which items we're spending money on. And so in a basic classic line item budget, like you see used in just about every local government, you will see that budget highlight, here's what the money's being spent on, and here's the amount of money we're spending. Sometimes these line item budgets are referred to as object of expenditure budgets. Here's the object we're spending the money on. Here's the amount we're spending on that object. So salaries, the amount. Benefits, the amount. Supplies, the amount. Maintenance, the amount. So it's a very simple type of budget. It's a traditional approach, but it does allow us to highlight the control feature, because we can compare how much we are spending this year to how much we spent last year. We can compare what we are spending money on this year to what we spent money on last year. So it's really oriented around Schick's first purpose of budgeting, which is the purpose of control. A line item budget is very much oriented around a decision-making model called incrementalism. Most budgeting is done through an incremental approach. In incrementalism, we make very small changes from year to year. So what you find in this year's budget will be predicated upon what was in last year's budget. So we spent X amount of money last year on salaries. This next year, we will add maybe 1 or 2 or 3% to that number. Very small incremental changes from one year to the next. And the reason why line item budgeting lends itself to incrementalist thinking is because you don't have enough information in a line item budget to do anything other than incrementalism. The only thing you really know is how much you spent last year and what you spent that money on. And that's what will then inform this year's budget. The advantage of that incremental type of an approach is that you can avoid large mistakes because you'll just keep redoing what you did in previous years, just with small incremental increases in the amount of the appropriations. However, if that program is not working and you're just going to blindly repeat it year in and year out, you may avoid large mistakes, but you'll continue to make those small mistakes each and every year. But line item budgeting really is the backbone of budgeting, especially at the local level of government. And I guarantee when you pull your city's budget and you look at it, 100% I can guarantee there will be a line item component to that local budget. But we realize that, as Schick tells us, a budget document can be a lot more than just a document to control how much money we're spending and what we're spending that money on. As Schick tells us, we may want to use our budget document to help us manage the performance of our organization. So a budget document can be used to highlight the management feature. That's a performance-based budget. In a performance-based budget, we will include empirical indicators of performance activities. So we'll look at what we are actually spending that money on. And then we will have performance indicators to ask the question, not just how much are we spending, but how well are we spending that money. Now, performance-based budgeting, highlighting this management feature, was an innovation that came about in the 1940s and the 1950s in the form of what we refer to as classical performance-based budgeting. Classical performance-based budgeting focused on outputs. So it asks the question, based upon these inputs, these resources that are coming into our organization, how is the organization taking those inputs and then translating those inputs into the things that are actually being created by the organization? What the organization is actually creating. So the implementation of a program, that is what we consider to be an output. So we looked at the comparison of inputs to outputs to ask the question, could we spend the money more efficiently in order to create those outputs? And that's what we call classic performance-based budgeting. We kind of saw performance-based budgeting tail off in popularity in the 60s and the 70s, but we saw a major renaissance in performance-based budgeting in the 1990s. When performance-based budgeting came back in the 1990s, it came back in the form of new performance-based budgeting. In new performance-based budgeting, we shifted the focus from the outputs, the goods and the services being created by the organization, and we shifted our focus more toward outcomes. Outcomes are the consequences of the outputs that we are creating. So we really got very interested in how are we spending the money in order to meet the needs of citizens who are consuming these outputs that we are creating. So when you talk about new performance-based budgeting, you're clearly talking about outcomes. With classic performance-based budgeting, you're talking more about outputs. But either way, we are looking at how well we are spending the money. We are generating additional information in our budget document that we can then use to better manage the operations of our organization. So we now have information on the activities that we are funding. We have information on how well those activities are helping us create the output we're trying to create. And then we also have information that will tell us how well that output is helping us achieve the consequences and the goals that we want to achieve for our consumers, for our beneficiaries. So the movement from line item to performance-based budgeting is really a movement away from the incrementalist type of decision-making and a move more toward a more rational orientation to how we make decisions. So if incrementalism is a decision-making model that just makes very small changes from one year to the next, rationality or rational comprehensive decision-making is a decision-making model in which we gather all the information we possibly can, We create a full range of different alternatives for solving our problems, and then we select the best alternative, and that best alternative then gets funded within our public budget. So it's a much more ambitious way of thinking about public budgeting than just the simple incrementalist type of decision-making model that really carried the day with a more traditional type of format like line item budgeting. So line item is organized around the idea of controlling our expenditures. Performance-based budgeting, both classical as well as new performance-based budgeting, is more oriented around the management feature of a budget document. Then to move even more in the transition, if you will, from incrementalism to more rational thought process, we then move into our third budget format, and that's a program-based budget. Program-based budgeting really highlights the third feature, the third purpose of budgeting that Schick tells us about, which is the planning feature. Now we're going to use this program-based budget to help us strategically plan the operations of our organization. So it's a strategic planning document that shows us how each element of our organization, each activity and each unit, and really each individual in our organization interacts with every other element in our organization in order to achieve our goals and our objectives. Now, where program-based budgeting is much different than performance-based budgeting is in a true program-based budgeting approach. Your budget is going to look different than line item or performance-based budgeting. In line item budgeting, in performance-based budgeting, you will budget according to department and unit. So you'll have a police department budget. You'll have a fire department budget. You'll have maybe an emergency services budget, but you will budget according to the unit or the department. In a program-based budget, you don't budget according to unit and department, but rather you budget according to program. So think about a program like protection of persons and property. The police department will contribute to the outcome of protecting persons and property. The fire department will also contribute to the protection of persons and property. Those activities that are being done by the police department and the fire department that further the goals of protecting persons and property, all those activities get budgeted together, irrespective of which department is spending the money. So you're kind of commingling your police spending and your fire spending if that police and that fire spending goes toward furthering the goals of protecting persons and property. So when you look at a program budget, that budget will be organized around the program rather than the unit or the department. So as you look at your city budget for this class, you are going to, if you have a program-based budget, you're going to see that relatively easily. You will see that will be organized around programs rather than being organized around units or departments. Now, program-based budgeting really had its heyday at the federal level, especially in the Department of Defense. Bud McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, brought program-based budgeting into the DoD. The DoD still uses a variation of program-based budgeting today. So 60 years later, we still see an element of program-based budgeting used for the Department of Defense. Then our fourth budget format also highlights the planning feature, the planning purpose of a budget document, and that's called a zero-based budget. Now, the difference between a zero-based budget and our other three budget formats is that zero-based budgeting is really more about a process than a finalized document. In zero-based budgeting, it's very much of a bottom-up process for putting your budget together. So what you want to do in zero-based budgeting is you want to include everyone that you can in the budgeting process. Typically, budgets tend to be made at the top level of the agency. In zero-based budgeting, you go all the way down your organizational hierarchy until you get to the lowest point in your organizational chart where budget decisions are made. The lowest level in your organization where budget decisions are made is what you identify as a decision unit. So you first look at your organizational chart, you go down the organizational chart, the lowest level where any budget decisions are made, you then term those decision units. Each one of those decision units is then charged with creating what are called decision packages. A decision package will present to you several different alternatives for funding an activity. So in a decision package, you'll say, here are the different alternatives for achieving our goals, and here are the consequences of funding each one of these alternatives. So if we fund it next year at the same level that we funded this activity at this year, chances are, because of the increase in inflation, in the erosion, the value of the dollar, we may only be able to serve 95% of the people we served last year if we spend the same amount of money. That's a consequence of spending the same amount this year as we spent last year. Another alternative might be spend 5% more. Well, if we spend 5% more, we might be able to serve an additional 100 or 200 clients. That's a consequence of spending that additional money. So each package will then lay out different alternatives and the consequences for each of those alternative approaches to funding that activity. Once decision units have developed all these different decision packages, they will then rank and prioritize each one of those packages. Those ranked decision packages will then get sent up the organizational chart from the decision units up to the next level of management. The next level of management will review those decision packages, will re-rank and reprioritize those packages, and then transmit those re-ranked packages up to upper levels of management. Upper level of management will review those packages again, will re-rank those packages. The highest ranked packages will then become that agency's budget. So it's very much of a holistic kind of grassroots bottom-up approach to putting a budget together. So zero-based budgeting is very process-oriented. I will caution you on one thing. You could very well have a zero-based process going on in an organization, but the resulting budget for that organization can look very line item in nature. So the natural question would be, how do I know if my city is using zero-based budgeting? You'll know your city is using zero-based budgeting because if they are going through all of this work and all this effort, they are going to scream it from the rooftops. They're going to tell everyone that they're using zero-based budgeting. So when you look at your budget and you look at your letter of transmittal and you look at your budget summary, if your city is using a zero-based budgeting process, you will see them talk about that probably in both their letter of transmittal as well as their budget summary. Now that being said, it is relatively unusual to see zero-based budgeting processes used at the local level of government. We are much more likely to see them used at the state level. And there are states, Georgia, Virginia, a little bit in Texas, even a little bit in California, of states that use some element of zero-based budgeting in putting their state budgets together. So it's much more common at the state level. In the Carter administration in the late 1970s, Carter brought zero-based budgeting into the federal government. Before Jimmy Carter became president, he was governor of Georgia. When he was governor of Georgia, he borrowed zero-based budgeting from Texas Instruments, from the private sector, and applied it to the state of Georgia. He thought it worked so well in the state of Georgia that when he became president, he brought it to Washington, D.C. with him. The problem was that with zero-based budgeting, it is such an in-depth process that you create a mountain of paperwork. And you think about it, you're creating all these different decision packages from all these different decision units. One given organization could have thousands upon thousands of decision packages. You're creating a mountain of paperwork. You're making the budgeting process a lot more difficult and a lot more time-consuming than it used to be. Because of that, there was a lot of resistance on the part of federal managers to actually buy into zero-based budgeting, and zero-based budgeting kind of died out and faded out at the federal level. But it still is alive and well in a lot of state, or at least a few state governments. Now, with zero-based budgeting, it's kind of a misnomer because it has the word zero right in its title. So a lot of people hear about zero-based budgeting, they think, oh, well, we go back to zero and we rebuild our entire budget. You just don't have the time or the energy or the resources to do that. So typically when zero-based budgeting is used, we usually see it used in a modified version. So it would be modified zero-based budgeting. In modified zero-based budgeting, we will only subject a percentage of our budget to a zero-based budgeting process. And a very typical percentage is 80-20. So we'll apply 20% of our budget to zero-based budgeting. We'll subject 20% of our budget to zero-based budgeting, and then the remaining 80% we will do in a traditional basic line item approach. Then the next year, we will then rotate and subject a different 20% to zero-based budgeting. Then the next year, another 20%, and so on and so on. So at the very minimum, at least once every 5 years, an agency and a program will be subjected to this holistic rational review known as zero-based budgeting. Just make zero-based budgeting a little bit more practical because it is a very resource-intensive and time-intensive way of putting a budget together. When you look at these 4 different formats, and there are others, there's priority-driven budgeting, there's envelope budgeting, and I'll provide some examples for you on the website, but we really focus on these 4 formats because these are the most popular formats you see used here in the U.S. Another example is expenditure control budgeting, or ECB. You'll see some cities use that. But for the most part, these 4, line item, performance, program, and zero-based, are the most common types of budget formats we see used in the U.S. And so that's why we really focus on them for this course. But as you look at the transition we went through from line item to performance to program to zero-based budgeting, it's important to note that it really is marked by a movement toward rationality, moving away from incremental decision-making and moving toward incorporating more and more information into our budgets and our budgetary process. Anytime you include more information into your decision-making, you are moving from the incremental to the more rational. And we know we can never be purely rational with anything that we do in public administration, but at least we're moving a little bit more toward rationality by using more information and allowing our budget document to be of more utility to us than just controlling the amount of money that we are spending. Another caution that you should keep in mind as well is that even though we have presented these as 4 different budget formats, they're not mutually exclusive. And it is common to see a government use a line item and performance approach, where the appearance of their budget format will look very line item in nature, but they will incorporate some activities and some performance expectations and performance measures within their budget. So kind of combining the line item and the performance. Some organizations will combine performance and program budgeting together, and you'll have a program performance budgeting system, otherwise known as PPBS. PPBS was a major initiative at the federal level in the 1960s, primarily in the Lyndon Johnson administration, but it's a way in which we can combine the best of both worlds, the advantages of a performance budget with some of the advantages of a program-based budget. And then as I already mentioned to you, zero-based budgeting, a zero-based budgeting process can certainly ultimately result in what looks and feels a whole lot like a line item budget. So even though we've presented 4 different formats, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I think it's usually useful at this point is to show you some examples of what these 4 different budget formats look like, walk you through the examples so you really get a good sense of what they look like so that when you see them, you'll be able to recognize what type of budget format your city is using. Okay, now for a line item budget. And you're probably familiar with line item budgeting. I'm sure you've seen these before. When you pulled the budget that you're going to use for your city for this class, it probably was a line item budget, or at least had line item budgeting components to it. The spreadsheet that you usually use in this course for your assignment is a line item budget. So you can see, like we have on the screen, very simple line item budget. Here's the object of expenditure. So personnel services, principal engineer, senior engineer, number of hours, wage per hour, and then the total amount being spent on that object of expenditure. Operating expenses, equipment, professional and consultant services, construction, contracted services, those are all what we call line items. Those are all objects of expenditure. We can see the amount of money that's being spent on each one of those objects. However, in a line item budget, the information you'll see missing, any information in terms of performance expectations, any information in terms of information that will provide us with information on how we are operating as an organization. We have none of those performance expectations. We have none of that performance-based information. Very simple, very quick way of putting a budget together. When you put your budget together in a line item type of variety, the only information you have to put that budget together is the line item budget from the preceding budget cycle. That's the only information you have. So you are forced to be incremental in your decision making in terms of what gets included in the budget and what does not get included in the budget. So it's a very simple line item type of budget. Okay, and here's an example of a performance-based budget. This is a performance-based budget from what's called the LBB, the Legislative Budget Board for the state of Texas. Texas has a very legislatively dominated budget process, and a lot of their budget process is controlled by this LBB, this Legislative Budget Board. So here's an example of a performance-based budget for the Department of Aging. So the mission of the Department of Aging is listed there, and then you have your goals to enable older Texans to live dignified, independent, and productive lives within a safe living environment through an accessible, locally based, comprehensive, coordinated continuum of services and opportunities. Then here are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. Percentage of older population receiving services who are low income, percentage of older population receiving services who are moderately to severely impaired, and so on. So we've established for ourselves, here are the types of things that we are trying to achieve with the money that we are spending here in the Department of Aging. So what are you spending that money on? Well, you're spending that money on things such as the number of certified ombudsmen, the number of persons receiving options case management, and so on and so on. You'll then see an efficiencies category. So here's the cost per certified ombudsman. Here's the cost per options case management client. So we are indexing the amount of money we are spending on the activities that we are engaging in. So we can have an actual per unit cost for the amount of money that we are spending. If that per unit cost is increasing compared to last year, that would probably signal us to ask some questions as to why it's increasing. Is that increase just a function of inflationary influences, or are those increases because we are not being as efficient as we possibly could be? More outputs here: number of congregate meals served, number of home delivered meals served, number of meals reimbursed by USDA. Again, this is information we can take and compare to previous years to see if our performance levels are increasing as compared to what we were doing in previous years. It's giving us this type of information that we need in order to better manage the operations of our organization. So we get those performance, the activity information, and we link it up to the performance. How well are we spending the money? Not just how much we're spending, what we're spending it on, but how well we are spending that money. That's an example of a performance-based budget. I think I've got an example for you on the website. You can go and take a look at it at your leisure. But that's the type of idea we're trying to get at with what we call performance-based budgeting. And now here we have an interesting example of when we take a performance-based budget, we then combine it with a program-based budget. And here's an example for the city of Sunnyvale, California. And it looks at a program of police services. So this is program number 412, police services. Lists for us our outcomes that we are trying to achieve. So we're trying to provide a safe community and a feeling of security among citizens by the protection of lives, property, and rights of all people, deterrence and prevention of crime, apprehension and prosecution of offenders, maintenance of order and resolution of conflict, prompt response to incidents requiring immediate police attention, and the development and maintenance of a safe and orderly flow of traffic in a fair, prompt, sensitive, and courteous manner to the satisfaction of citizens. So that's our goal. That's what we are trying to achieve. Here are some outcome measures, some goals that we are trying to achieve in doing our police services and doing this protection of persons and property. So for this program 412 Police Services, some of our outcomes are to achieve an average 7-year weighted FBI crime index rate below a rate per 100,000 population, 54% below the national weighted FBI crime rate. So we want to be 54% below the national rate, 63% below the California weighted FBI crime rate, and 38% below the Santa Clara County weighted crime rate. So we have goals at both the national, the state, and the local level. So we want to be 54% lower than the feds, we want to be 63% lower than the state rate, and we want to be 38% lower than our county rate. Then you'll see another goal, average 7-year weighted clearance rate for the crimes of murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and burglary, 59% above the national weighted clearance rate for these crimes, 66% above the California weighted clearance rate. So we want to clear these crimes at these rates higher, this percentage higher than what the national level is and what the state level is. A budget cost ratio, BCR, of at least 1.0, because if you're at 1.0, then your benefits and your costs at the very least are equating with each other. Traffic collision ratio per million miles traveled at the previous 3-year average is achieved, and the ratio there, 2.8, followed by 2.31, followed by 2.31, and so on and so on. Response times, you can see all the different outcome measures that we are trying to achieve. So what we are doing here is we are combining this program approach, because we're budgeting around the program of police services, but we are also including performance expectations so that we know whether or not we are achieving performance levels that we want to achieve. You can then go, and as you go through, and again, I've got an example of this up on the website for you, but as you go through it, you will then drill down into the actual specific activities that you are funding that will help you achieve those goals you're trying to achieve. And so within program 412, our service delivery plan 4120101 is crime control and order maintenance. In order to achieve our goals in crime control and order maintenance, we will have to fund police patrols. And so you'll see activity 412000, provide police patrols. Number of hours patrolled for each of the years and the costs associated with the number of hours. And so, for example, you've got, 37,756 work hours. And that thing is going to cost you $3,051,717.23. So this is where you're actually linking up the specific activity that you are funding with the amount of money that activity will cost. Then, as we saw before, that activity is then linked to a program area, and that program area is then linked to the overall program of police services, the protection of persons and property. So as you can see, what we've done is we've organized the budget, or at least Sunnyvale has organized their budget around programs, and then within each one of their programs, they have then drilled down to specific activities that are being funded with the money in that budget, and then linking those activities up to how they help us accomplish the goals that we are trying to accomplish as a program. So again, this kind of qualifies what we call a program performance budget, because we're combining both a program orientation along with performance-based measures. Okay, and then finally, our fourth format to show you is a zero-based budgeting example. And this is a very simple one. They're usually much more complicated than this, but I thought it would be easier just to kind of show you a very simplified one. But here's a zero-based budgeting example for a decision unit, the Special Programs Office. And so we've gone through the organization. We've identified the lowest level at which decisions can be made. We've then termed those decision units. So for this decision unit, it is a special programs office. So the special programs office then puts together decision packages. So here's decision package number 1. Decision package number 1 is for a bookmobile program. Purpose of the bookmobile is to provide service to remote regions served by the library, enhance quality of life for the county's homebound and senior citizens or citizens without access to transportation. So that's the goal of the bookmobile program. And then here are your alternatives. Alternative number 1 is the base level of funding. 90% of what we funded the bookmobile at last year. That 90% funding level would allow us to provide 25 hours per week as our activity level. So the bookmobile could operate for 25 hours per week at a cost of $36,000. The second alternative is the current level of funding, 100% of what we have currently been funding in it. That would allow us to operate the bookmobile for 30 hours per week at a cost of $40,000. Third alternative is the enhanced level, funded at 110%, so 10% more than what we usually funded at. 35 hours per week in activities and $44,000 as costs. What are the consequences? Well, the consequences are a reduced funding level means lower circulation rates among our elderly library patrons. So we can now make a decision about, well, how important is it for us to maintain our circulation rates among our elderly patrons? Is it important we keep the levels where they're at? Is it important that we serve more by having 5 additional hours per week? Or are we okay with serving our elderly patrons less and cutting back for 5 hours per week on our activity levels? It gives us those alternatives that we can choose from within that decision package. If we didn't want to do a bookmobile, an alternative program could be a van service, but that van service was rejected because the insurance costs for the van service were cost prohibitive compared to keeping with our current bookmobile. Decision package 2, in-school programs to encourage library use among grade school students and to enhance existing literacy programs. Programs targeted at low-income neighborhood schools. Same type of idea here. Here's your current level, 10 hours per week, serving 2 elementary schools, $25,000 costs. We could reduce that by 10%, which we'll lose 2 hours per week, but we'll save $2,500. Or we can enhance it and spend 10% more, increasing our hours up to 12 hours per week, but it will increase our cost by $2,500 up to $27,500. Consequences: reduced funding will affect literacy efforts and may affect standardized test scores. An alternative to the in-school program would be an after-school program at the library, but it would require additional staffing, again, additional insurance costs. So we passed by the after-school program and we decided to stick with the in-school program, but we have to decide which funding level to support. And again, you've got your consequences of reducing versus augmenting your funding levels. And so on and so on. I won't go through them all, but there are several decision packages on here. This is a very simplified approach of what a decision package looks like. And I really do want to emphasize this is a highly simplified approach. To give you an example, the state of Virginia does zero-based budgeting. State of Virginia requires that every agency that does zero-based budgeting, for every decision package that the agency creates, those decision packages must be a minimum of 40 to 50 pages. Now each of these decision packages is 1 page, but in reality, they're going to be much more in-depth and much more complicated than that. But think about if you're a Virginia agency and you're subjected to zero-based budgeting, every single one of your decision packages must be at least 40 pages, and you end up doing 300 of those decision packages. You do the math and you can just see how exponentially it increases your workload and results in a mountain of paper. So that's why most organizations that use zero-based budgeting will use a modified approach, where they will not subject their entire budget to zero-based budgeting. But I just want to present to you here just examples of the 4 different budget formats that we typically see used by local and state governments here in the U.S., so that when you look at your budget, you're able to identify what type of budget format your city is using. And then, like I said, I've also included a couple of other examples on our website. You can go and take a look at things like priority-driven budgeting and kind of get an idea how those work. But we focus on these 4: line item, performance program, and zero base, because they are the most common types of budget formats that we tend to see. So I hope this clarifies those 4 budget formats for you a little bit, allows you to see an example of what they look like, so that, again, when you see one, you know what you're looking at. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to clarify any of the information. So thanks again for listening, and I hope everyone has a great week.